Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of Texas History for Kids. This is episode number 54. I'm your host, Michelle Gallegos. Let's go ahead and get started. Over 500 years, in February of 1519, a Spanish explorer named Hernán Cortés set out from Cuba on a mission to explore and take over the Aztec civilization in what is now Mexico. Within 2 years, the powerful Aztec ruler Montezuma was dead, and the capital city had fallen. Cortés declared the Aztec Empire as part of Spain. While Spanish weapons and battle strategies were important to the victory, most of the destruction came from a deadly disease that was brought by the Europeans. It's the year 1519. A massive wooden ship cuts through the waves as it sails from Cuba, carrying one of the most daring explorers in all of history, Hernán Cortés. His mission? To find and conquer one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. But Cortés isn't alone. He was not just bringing soldiers, swords, and canyons. No, he's carrying something else. Something invisible. Something deadly. It would soon change the fate of the Aztec nation forever. But what could be so powerful that it would bring an entire empire to its knees? This story involves the fall of the Aztecs, including battles, betrayals, and a terrifying secret weapon that no one would see coming. In February of 1519, Cortés stepped off his ship onto the coast of Mexico. He wasn't just any explorer, he was determined to find gold, glory for his motherland, and essentially more territory for Spain. But the Aztecs, led by their ruler Montezuma, weren't about to just hand over their powerful empire. They were ready to fight. Their capital city, which is now where Mexico City is, was more magnificent than anything the Spaniards had ever seen before. The city was built on a lake with temples, towering structures, and a busy marketplace. Cortés was amazed, but he had one goal in mind: control. And he would stop at nothing to get it. What Cortés didn't know was that this mission would change the course of history forever. He was about to face one of the greatest civilizations of all time. But he had a dangerous, invisible ally that would do more damage than any sword could. What was it? Well, get to that soon. But first, let's talk about Montezuma, the Aztec ruler. He welcomed Cortés at first sight. He even offered him gifts, believing Cortés might be a god. But soon, the Spaniards' true intentions were revealed. Once they learned that he was not just a visitor, but wanted to take over their lands, tensions grew. And it wasn't long before the situation in Mexico City spiraled out of control. Then, something terrifying happened. People in the city began to fall sick. A rash that started as small red dots on the tongue and in the mouth. Then they noticed those spots had changed into sores that would break open and be very painful. The fevers got worse, and sometimes that alone would kill them. But for many, it wasn't the end. Once the sores in the mouth started to break down, a red rash would appear on the skin, starting on the face and spreading to the arms and the legs, and then to the hands and the feet. Usually it spread to all parts of the body within just 24 hours. As this rash appears, the fever begins to decline, and the person might start to feel better. But by the 4th day, the skin sores fill with a thick, clear liquid and often have a dent in the center. Once the skin sores fill with liquid, the fever may rise again. and remain high until scabs form over the bumps. No one knew why or where this disease came from. And the worst part, the disease didn't stop with just a few people. It spread like wildfire. No matter how hard the Aztecs tried to fight, they couldn't defeat this invisible enemy. Their warriors were strong, but they were no match for what the Spaniards had unknowingly brought with them. Cortez didn't even have to lift a finger. What was this mysterious force that was taking down the Aztecs? But before I reveal that, let's think about this. What would you do if your city started to crumble around you and you couldn't see the cause? Would you run, fight, or try to protect your family? When we come back, I'll tell you the answer to this mystery and how it sealed the fate of the entire Aztec Empire. Hello, all you history buffs out there. I'm Michelle Gallegos, a former educator turned podcaster. Are you passionate about learning stories of Texas history that you don't exactly get to learn in school? Sure, you've heard about native tribes, a few famous battles, and historical figures like Stephen F. Austin. All topics that every Texas student should learn about. But what if I could offer you even more? Imagine not only listening to this podcast, but also having access to reading materials that accompany each episode, making it easier to dive into the topics that interest you most. I think you'll love what I have to offer. Alongside each podcast episode, I've created detailed digital reading resources and comprehension activities designed to deepen your understanding and enhance your knowledge. These materials are perfect for students who are eager to explore topics further, and for teachers looking for ready-to-use activities in the classroom for resources. You'll find true, factual stories about Texas history, complete with suggested activity questions that bring classroom discussions to life. Dive deeper into our episodes by visiting michelleauthor.com and get access to engaging material, fun activities, and captivating historical stories. Let's make education enjoyable and impactful together. Welcome back. So, what was this invisible force? It wasn't a sword, a cannon, or even a clever battle plan. It was disease, smallpox to be exact. The Europeans had carried it with them across the ocean, not knowing that the people in the Americas had never been exposed to it before. Their immune systems weren't ready to fight it off. Smallpox spread quickly throughout the Aztec nation, killing thousands of people, including some of their best warriors. Montezuma's empire was already weakened before the battles even began. Imagine that, a mighty empire brought down by something so small you couldn't even see it. And here's the scariest part. Cortez didn't understand what was happening. He had expected a very tough battle, but smallpox did most of the work for him. During the 1700s, smallpox was a significant and deadly disease that impacted various populations in Texas, especially Native American communities. The disease was introduced by the Americas by European explorers, as I said, including the Spanish who were expanding their territories in the region. In Texas, the disease spread rapidly among Native American tribes, particularly those in contact with the Spanish missions and settlements. The indigenous people had no immunity to smallpox because they had never experienced it before. This led to a devastating outbreak. Smallpox would even wipe out entire villages or severely reduce the population of tribes like the Comanches, the Apaches, and others that were living in what is now known as Texas. The Spanish colonizers were also affected by smallpox. They had experience with the disease, but they could rely on methods to quarantine the sick or maintain outbreaks, kind of similar to what we did with COVID. However, the Native American communities lacked all of this knowledge. They had never seen this before. and the disease decimated their numbers, severely impacting their cultures and their social structures. Smallpox in Texas also played a role in weakening the Native American resistance to Spanish colonization, as the population losses made it more difficult for them to mount significant opposition to the American settlers. So, this impeded how the Native Americans were going to fight against the Spanish, and that is ultimately why they were taken over so quickly. During the 1700s in Texas and other parts of the Americas as well, treatment for smallpox was basic and not really developed and often ineffective. People had little understanding of how to properly manage this disease, so they resorted to hasty or even desperate methods in an attempt to control its spread or alleviate any symptoms. So, we're going to talk about some of the common but harmful treatments that were happening during this time of the smallpox breakouts. The first one is called bloodletting. This practice was led in Europe and brought over to the Americas by the European colonists. People believed that draining a patient's blood would help balance their bodily humors and fight the disease. However, this often weakened the patient and made recovery less likely. Another thing they did was isolate and quarantine, similar to what we did during COVID. Although this was one of the more effective responses, isolation was often done very hastily and under poor conditions. People with smallpox were confined to crude structures, often with little medical care, food, or proper sanitation. Entire villages of Native Americans who contracted the smallpox disease might be abandoned by those who tried to flee the disease. Another thing they tried were herbal remedies. With limited understanding of what smallpox actually was, people turned to traditional herbal remedies, hoping to reduce fever or soothe anything that was uncomfortable to them. So some of these treatments were based on local plants and they'd offer mild relief, but many were still ineffective against spreading the disease. A lot of people believed that inducing sweat could also burn out the disease. Patients were placed in hot environments or wrapped in very heavy blankets to sweat out the illness. And this often led to dehydration, sadly, which worsened their condition, especially in the sweltering Texas climate. So in contrast to the heat, they also added cold. So some caregivers subjected patients to cold baths or exposure to cool air in an attempt to reduce the fever. However, this could cause a person to go into shock or even pneumonia. So that may not have been the best alleviation either. Another very crazy idea they came up with was scarification. Though it was less common in Texas in the 1700s, some communities experimented with early forms of what's called inoculation. This involves intentionally introducing smallpox materials, such as the pus from the smallpox sores, into a healthy person's skin through small cuts. Sometimes it worked by inducing a small case of the disease, but it was very risky and could still result in a full-blown smallpox outbreak. Another thing that in both European and Native American communities happened was superstitions and religious rituals. So people turned to their spiritual practices through prayer and rituals, believing that the disease might be a punishment from the divine forces. While this brought comfort to some, it did little to alleviate the physical suffering that was caused by smallpox. So during the smallpox outbreaks in the 1700s, various communities in Texas and across the Americas developed these rituals in an attempt to combat or understand the disease altogether. These rituals were often rooted in spiritual beliefs and cultural practices, reflecting the lack of scientific understanding of the disease and the desire to appeal to any gods or higher powers or supernatural forces for protection or healing. So some of the different rituals that they had In Spain, Spanish settlers and missionaries in Texas often turned to holding masses, processions, and prayers to invoke the divine intervention. People prayed to saints, particularly Saint Roch, which is the saint of plague victims, asking for protection and healing from smallpox. So Spanish missionaries also prayed for divine help to protect themselves and the native populations that were living in their missions. As for the Native American communities, they were similar, but they had their differences. They conducted ceremonies to appease the spirits, such as their prayer rituals, and they used dances and offerings. And in some cases, the shamans or the spiritual leaders would drive away the disease. But again, it was like unknown territory to them, so they really weren't sure what they were dealing with. So they burned herbs and they chose to fast, and they even incorporated sacred songs that might help them through it. Both Native American and European communities practiced purification rituals, believing that smallpox was represented by a spiritual impurity or like a contamination. So, for example, sweat lodges were used by Native American tribes to induce sweating and cleanse the body and the soul. Now, these sweat lodges often included prayers and chanting and cleansing the sick person or protecting healthy individuals from even getting the disease. Unfortunately, sometimes it worsened the condition because as I did say, sweating could also lead to somebody becoming very dehydrated, and dehydration while you're sick is not a good thing. And other Native American tribes offered different sacrifices or offerings to the gods, believing that if they offered animals or food or feathers or beads or even in some cases tobacco, they thought that they were trying to show their respect to the spirits, and they were asking them for relief from the suffering that was caused by the smallpox. In some extreme cases, some communities believed that a greater sacrifice, such as even a death of a person or an animal, might be necessary to appease the gods. Shamans, healers, or medicine men in Native American tribes often played a central role in fighting these smallpox diseases. They chanted and they drummed. They believed that the rhythm would drive out these spirits that were haunting them, and it would cause healing in their environment. They also did something called smudging. So they would burn sacred herbs or sage or sweetgrass, wave the smoke around the sick person and try to cleanse them in that way. And others decided they create herbal remedies by using the plants around them and having somebody drink it, or even applying the plant directly to the smallpox pustule and try to reduce fever that way. In some cases, these did work slightly. So people sometimes wore charms, protective charms or amulets to ward off the disease also. These often included crosses, medallions of saints, or even sacred stones or feathers that were believed to protect the power against smallpox. Now, of course, many people did die from the smallpox disease. So the death was so common that in some Native American communities, the diseases led to changes in the way they traditionally buried their dead. For example, out of fear of contagion, some tribes quickly burned or buried their bodies of the smallpox victims, sometimes without the usual rituals that they were accustomed to. However, many tribes still tried to perform their songs and prayers and burial ceremonies for the dead to honor their spirit and prevent unrest in the afterlife. So these rituals reflected the deep spiritual connection that many cultures had with their environment and their health. Unfortunately, these rituals did little to stop the spread of the disease, which required medical intervention like vaccination to truly combat and change it. So that's all for today's episode, guys. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to check out my website, michelleauthor.com, for more stories, activities, and resources. And if you're interested in reading more about this topic, shoot me an email with the subject line, smallpox epidemic, and I'll send you a free copy of the articles and activities that accompany this podcast. You can send me an email at michellegallegos.author@gmail.com. That's MICHELLEGALLEGOS.AUTHOR@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and remember, yesterday is today's history.